before we get going? Not hearing any, I will start presenting, and as soon as the PowerPoint pops up, Eric, feel free to go.
All right, welcome everybody. Here we are talking about the ADA Self-Evaluation and Transition Plan. I am Eric Bothy. I work in the Board of Public Service Design Division. I am the project manager for the Design Division. And let's see, we've already gone over the housekeeping. It's being recorded. We've got a sign language interpreter. And please wait till the end until we ask for questions. And please be sure to go ahead and submit your question in the Q&A box there, type at any time. And this will be made available via download. Next slide. Okay, we're going to talk about the team overview and why we prepare an ADA transition plan, ongoing city efforts, then current city self-evaluation efforts, and community engagement. Next slide. And here I am, and obviously I need a new picture. Also with me, with us today is David Neuberger, Commissioner, Office on the Disabled, Andrew Lackey, Deputy Commissioner, Office on the Disabled, Travis Helmkamp with Oates, who was talking earlier, Mike Bush, and Jim DeYoung with National ADA Consultant. And then we've also got, I do not believe they're here, but Gina Hilberry with Cohen Hilberry Architects and Sean Martin with M3 Engineering. They are doing the field assessments and the GIS analysis for all the data that they collect. And I will hand it over to David, who will talk about why prepare an ADA transition plan.
Thank you, Eric, Travis, and everybody. I'm glad to have people gather today. This whole project stems from the fact that many years ago, when the ADA was enacted, large numbers of organizations, including state and local government agencies, were required to review where they have barriers to access in their operations and to eliminate those barriers. For people or for entities that had more than 50 employees, they were required to write a self-evaluation, which was language used to describe the identification of barriers, and then a transition plan, which was to be a plan for how those barriers would be eliminated over time. Most cities and many other agencies did not get that work done in the time frame. Actually, just for the fun of it, you might like to know that the transition plans were supposed to be published in 1992. The law was passed in 1990, and people took a stock at it, but over the years, doing it in a formal kind of way has been a difficult task for many, including people in the city government, our city government. And so one of the things that we do in ensuring that the city's business is done fairly for employees breaks into two categories. One is that our policies and procedures need to be accessible. And so as a result of that, we invite people when we're making public meetings to let us know that they need interpreters, in which event we will provide interpreters. We offer, for example, water bills in whatever format a customer might need it, be it Braille, audio, large print, or whatever. We also do other things, like we work on making sure that our employees are not discriminated against under the ADA, and we try to make sure that the general public is able to access all of our services. And some examples, other examples, I mean, for example, our Meals on Wheels thing is part of eliminating barriers, the work we do in housing and so forth. A lot of the work that my office does today is working with plans for construction to make sure that those plans are done in a fully accessible way according to the standards that are presented by the Access Board and other relevant agencies. For many years, we've done stuff. For example, many of you have seen many curb ramps. We actually started putting in curb ramps in the 70s, even before there was even a law about that. But the curb ramps have gotten more and more sophisticated as the standards have gotten more and more sophisticated. One of the things about the curb ramps that we used to put in are what we call diagonal curb ramps. And if you use the curb ramp to guide the direction of the ramp to know where you're going, that aims you right into the middle of the intersection and not directly across the street. So we modify the designs now and try to make the curb ramp clear for somebody whose vision isn't so good where the other side of the street is. So, and all of the construction that the city does now is in compliance with current standards for accessibility. But there are still a lot of problems in the community, and that's why we're undertaking this plan, this process, which my colleagues will continue to describe further. So I think it's Jim's turn to take over.
Yes, thanks, David. I think before we kind of move on to sort of the current part of the ADA transition plan, I would like to take a second for questions and answers. If anybody has any questions, as you arrived, everybody was muted. So if you would like to speak, if you can please hit the unmute button, feel free to. Not hearing any questions and not having any questions in the chat or the Q&A, I'll hand it off to Jim DeYoung, and he'll start talking about sort of what are the current efforts that we're doing to sort of move the city forward in the future.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. Your input and interest in this issue, as well as concerns, is exactly what we wanted to do during this process. This is to be very citizen-driven and to involve the public and to get your input. So again, we appreciate you being here, and we want to make it clear that we are continuing the ongoing city efforts. As David has indicated, they did not just begin with the ADA, or they did not end with the ADA. They've been doing efforts, and this is a chance to consolidate and bring all of the activities that have occurred, as well as those that need to occur, into one plan, so that the city is able to negotiate making things more accessible for all people of the city, as well as visitors and those who work in the city. It's a part self-evaluation. We will not be able to, obviously, during the COVID year that we just all experienced, as well as, with the size of the city and the multiple miles of sidewalks, curb ramps, and pedestrian signals and buildings located throughout the city, we're not able to tackle all of those, but we're able to select those that represented different parts of the city, as well as different types of buildings, as an example, to be used. Recreation might be different than what you'd find in paying, for instance, a water bill. And so we're able to look at that, but it's not complete in doing the entire city. We believe it's representative of that. And again, we want to get your input. It's an update to view the facilities, looking at current conditions, of the curb ramps and pedestrian signals, conditions of city buildings, properties, and parks, and then an attempt to identify the barriers of access within those various facilities, and of course, budgeting and scheduling to complete the remaining assessments that we'll need to do in the future, but also to put a plan in place to start to deal with the access issues that have been identified. The whole idea of the Americans with Disabilities Act was the full inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of society. I know David and myself were very involved in the passage of the ADA and seeing it, and we wanted very much consumer driven as well as community driven. And this is a great chance for the community to be involved, as well as for the city to really take inventory of not only what they've done, but what they need to do to make that the city programs, services, and activities accessible to all people within the city. So again, we thank you all for being here and look forward to hearing your feedback.
Thanks, Jim. Sort of getting into sort of the nitty gritty of what we're doing here. The first thing that we took a look at was the review of city policies. Whenever anything is built new in the city of St. Louis on public right-of-way, we want to make sure that that's being constructed in an accessible manner, that it meets those current ADA standards, and really to have consistency across city departments. One thing that we found as we started to investigate the city is that there's a lot of different departments that are doing construction within the city at all times. And with that consistency of city policies and details across the city, we can really start to get a pedestrian network that allows the user to sort of understand and to sort of predict what those curb ramps, what those sidewalks are going to look like. Ultimately, this all started with establishing ADA criteria, not just those federal standards that David talked about in the beginning, but the state of Missouri has standards. The city of St. Louis has passed various ordinances over the years that has established that ADA criteria, and to really make sure that we understood all the various criteria and to make sure that what was built going forward meets all those different requirements. The last part of this, and really this is the most crucial part of what we're looking at here, is making sure that what's being built out in the field meets ADA. It's all great to have a set of plans or to have a permit that says that everything that's going to be built is going to meet ADA standards. But ultimately, it's about what gets built out in the field and that meets the ADA requirements of the city. Moving on to the self-evaluation phase of this, and really this is sort of the big chunk of an ADA transition plan, of sort of what is the current status of the city of St. Louis. For the physical elements themselves, we kind of broke that up into two different sections. The first section is the pedestrian network. So that includes sidewalks, curb ramps, pedestrian traffic signals, everything that someone uses to walk, roll, wheel around the city. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to determine how we can compare various pedestrian assets throughout the city. You know, there's a limited amount of money that's available to make improvements. So how do we prioritize those improvements that are really going to impact how someone gets around the city? The way that we propose doing this and the way that we're going about doing this is a two-part scoring system. The first part of that is a citywide prioritization map. And really what that is an effort to do is that is an effort to estimate where people are trying to walk in the city of St. Louis. The number of walkers that are going to be out there, and also can we take a look at sort of the characteristics of those walkers. The second part of the scoring system is what is the physical condition of that sidewalk. It can be a sidewalk that everybody's using, but if it's a perfectly compliant sidewalk, then that sidewalk doesn't need to be fixed. On the other hand, there may be a sidewalk that is in poor shape, But if it's in a part of the city that doesn't get a lot of heavy pedestrian traffic and there's no history of complaints, that may be a lower sidewalk on the prioritization list. What we refer to that as the accessibility score. And ultimately what that comes down to is assigning a value for each barrier. And really what that allows us to do is quantify the impact of that barrier to pedestrians. I think a good example of an accessibility score is whenever you think about tripping hazards or sort of changes in elevations for sidewalk panels. Anything greater than a 1/4 inch is technically non-compliant on the ADA unless it's beveled, in which you can go up to a 1/2 inch. But for someone who's using a stroller or someone in a wheelchair, there's a big difference between a 1/4 inch displacement and one of those 2 or 3 inch displacements that you sometimes see on city sidewalks. In those cases, really what we're trying to do is prioritize those 2 or 3 inch displacements, and the 1/4 inch are technically non-compliant, but those will be addressed later on in the plan. Going back to the citywide prioritization map, and we think this is a really good place in which sort of the community can help us understand the city better. Because again, we're trying to estimate where people are trying to walk to in the city. And by the more feedback that we get from city residents, the better understanding we get of how city residents are using the sidewalks. Really, our prioritization map is kind of split between 2 different components. The first one is the pedestrian traffic generators. That is things such as government buildings, schools, commercial corridors. Where are people going to shop? From our talking with the disability community, one of the things that we learned is the importance of metro bus routes and the way that metro bus routes enables people to get around the city. So that's one of our key pedestrian traffic generators is it on a metro bus line? For the socioeconomic data, we took that data from East-West Gateway, available census data, and really what we're looking at there is percentage of zero-car households. If you're someone who doesn't have access to an automobile, you're far more likely to be using the sidewalk to get to school, to get to your job, to get to the parks. Population density, where there's a lot of people living in close spaces, that increases the possibility of them walking. And lastly, percentage of people living with a disability. What we found looking at studies is that there is a correlation between walking and whether or not you have a disability. And so we're really looking to sort of prioritize those percentages because we know, number one, it's a more sensitive population, and number two, there is a correlation to not having access to an automobile. As I talked about earlier, we're looking at not only the pedestrian network, but also the city buildings, properties, and parks for ADA accessibility. As Jim already talked about a little bit, this is phase 1, but really what we're hoping to accomplish in phase 1 is the ability for the city to carry these assessments moving forward. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to determine sort of what makes a building accessible or not accessible, and how do we go about figuring out how to make that building more accessible. Really our scope, and it all starts with how does someone get to the site? And for us, that's not just parking lots. That's not just where's the accessible parking space, but it's if someone's arriving by bus, how do they get from the bus stop to the government building? If someone's using the sidewalk network, how do they get from the sidewalk network to the government building? Over on the right-hand side, this is the South Patrol of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. And for that, there's a bus stop up on the north end of the parking lot, as well as a public sidewalk that provides access to the police station. So for that, we really looked at all those different site arrival points, because ultimately, if you can't get in the building, it's less of an issue of accessibility inside the building. Once someone's in the building, the next thing we looked at is how are they trying to use that? And again, we think this is a place in which the community and you guys can really help us with this. Sort of what are the programs and services that you guys have challenges using, or maybe those buildings that we don't think about. Those buildings that we've spent a lot of time looking into this, but I'm sure we're missing a program or service that's only offered at one building and there's an accessibility issue to get there. And really what this feedback allows us to do is to say, okay, this needs to be a high priority, because if someone can't get here, they can't pay their water bill, or they can't sign up to get a permit to host a party or anything like that. Similar to the sidewalks, really what we're looking for here is barriers to access. What prevents someone from using that program or service? For recreation centers, it's, what prevents the kid from being able to go to the day camp, to attend the day camp with all his buddies? What prevents the lady from going to the yoga class because she wants to go there? What are those barriers to access? And I think it's important to note here that the answer isn't always going to be physical construction. The answer can be, if there's a program that's offered on the 3rd floor, can we move that program to the 1st floor because the 1st floor is accessible? Ultimately, the self-evaluation is going to say that everything needs to be accessible. But over time, as the city is working towards that, is there a way that we can increase accessibility for those programs and services while we ultimately work towards that long-term goal of complete accessibility? Sort of the next steps is, number one, to finalize that citywide prioritization map. And I think it's important to note that that is going to be a constantly evolving map as the city evolves. As the city changes, as priorities change, that map will continue to evolve with it. We have to establish a budget and schedule to ultimately complete the self-evaluation. And lastly, start to look for those projects that can kickstart those elimination of barriers and increase accessibility. I know that was a lot of talking I just did. So with that, we are going to take a second for question and answers. So if anybody has a question, please unmute yourself. If you can say your name, that'd be fantastic. But we would love to answer any questions that anybody might have.
I see at least 2 in the chat. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's 3 in the chat currently, so I'll go through those real quick. If anyone wants to unmute, just give me one moment till I go through these, and then you can chime in. Or if you want to type it into the chat or the Q&A, feel free, and we'll get to them there. So feel free to do that now. So the first question for the presentation team: will this effort include programs as well, thinking recreation, health, and human services? So I know you touched on that, Travis, if you want to elaborate any.
Maybe I can jump in on that if you don't mind.
Sure.
The answer is yes, and the answer is that we can do today. So if there are any barriers in terms of being able to take advantage of programs, then we need to work that out right away. If there's, and even to the extent that if a program is being conducted in a building that one can't get access to, then we need to work on moving the program someplace else. So anybody who has a thought about a program that is creating a problem, my office wants to hear that. We welcome people filing grievances, but we also welcome people just telling us about it, and we will follow up as quickly as we can on getting that solved. Those are usually not expensive, and therefore we can do it now.
Yeah, I think to follow up on David, the answer is yes, it's part of the self-evaluation. But again, don't wait for a phase for that to come. If there's a problem, reach out to David's office. There is contact information at the end of this for you, as well as if anybody does want to know how to get in touch with David's office. If you want to send an email to any of us, we'll have our email address as well. And that's a great way to get a hold of us. And I'll throw in a little plug, like David's office is always available. So yeah, if something comes up, please encourage people to reach out to David. That's the reason he's here, is to help.
All right, thanks, David and Travis. Next question. Does the prioritization map include identifying areas where audio crosswalk signals should be installed?
Again, you want me to jump in?
Yeah, David, if you want to start, I'll chime in after.
Okay. We have some people in the community who really need they're technically called accessible pedestrian signals. Those are the signals that have the little locator note that goes dong, 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 and it tells people where they can find the switch to push the button. And then when you get there, and if you push the button in the direction you want to go, a loudspeaker will either say, wait, 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 or it'll say, cross 24th, cross 24th, cross 24th. And it gives people really serious access to know when they can cross the street. Now, the trouble with those, is that they are expensive, because you have to really rebuild the whole signal system in order to get those to work. As a result of that, first of all, my office is always working towards getting anybody who is doing construction work that involves traffic signals to put APS in. But one of the problems that we have, and you know, this is not a very good excuse, but it's the truth. We have very little capital money except through grants. And as a result of that, when you see a project going on in the city, then those new signals as part of that project definitely should be put in. But there's not a big budget for solving that problem where there's no other activity going on in the city. We keep trying to find that money, and quite frankly, the more people tell us that it needs to be done, the more I can tell the rest of the city that, and we're pushing as hard as we can to try to get those spread as throughout the city as we can.
Just to follow up on the actual physical self-evaluation, that is one of the criteria that we assess at every pedestrian traffic signal, is whether the APS is present, is whether the push button is tactile or not. So yeah, that is one of the elements, and that is something that is being flagged during the self-evaluation.
So there was a follow-up question, part of that question, David and Travis. So the follow-up is, what is the process of getting more money for these types of measures?
Well, very often the money that is found for eliminating barriers is a result of some bigger project. Somebody wants to do a major work on an intersection, like Market or Tucker or West Florida Center, something like that. And when that is being planned, that is usually something that the Board of Public Service is very involved in the design of the whole thing. And we make sure that that design would be fully accessible, so that those designs always are modified to make sure that they include all the accessible features. But for example, we certainly have cases in which people live in neighborhoods where there's no work planned for the city at all right now, and yet those people need accessible pedestrian signals. And frankly, it's jawboning. Can we get money out of the alder people's budget? Can we find money someplace else? And it's always a difficult problem because doing it really means replacing the whole signal at the intersection. And we have been less successful than I would like to be in those circumstances.
Okay, thanks, David. Next question. When there are revitalization efforts at the landing, have you considered how to improve accessibility?
I would just say I can start, David, if you want to chime in. From the self-evaluation side of this, we're not really looking at any specific neighborhoods or any specific redevelopment efforts. What we're looking at is developing standards that meet accessibility. The landing, we might get into a conversation on historic areas. I'm not exactly sure if that's a historic district or not, But like one item that we're looking at as part of this is, can we develop a brick sidewalk detail that has the aesthetics of brick sidewalk while still meeting ADA standards? So I think that's something that may come up as part of like a landing redevelopment is, yes, you want brick sidewalks, but this is how you can put brick sidewalks in that still meets those ADA requirements.
And I will add that we have had over the last few years 2 occasions in which grant money has been found to improve streets. I believe that they're on 2nd and 1st Street, not extending the whole length of them, but that's happened in 2 occasions. And in each of those occasions, the agreement was that the sidewalks would be accessible sidewalks, and the intersections would be poured concrete so that they would remain accessible. The cobblestones would be retained, but they would be in the traffic lanes, not on the sidewalk and not in the intersection. And so there are a few places where that's been accomplished, and one relatively recently accomplished. But again, it happened because the business interests in the landing put forth to get the grant money from East West Gateway to improve the streetscape in the landing. And then we were able to jump in and say, but let's do it in a way that we make sure is accessible.
All right, thank you. Next question. Is the unreliability of delays in the Metro bus schedule something that will be factored into the transportation accessibility?
I think on our end, the honest answer to that is no. What we are focusing on is getting all citizens to the Metro bus, and sort of making sure that there's accessible sidewalk there for them to get from their house to the Metro bus. We're really not doing a lot of work on the actual Metro bus, or any work for that matter.
But there is an office that deals with accessibility for people with disabilities within bi-state. And frankly, the people who are in that office really recognize the need. So it is more than appropriate. They have their own consumer groups who meet and talk about issues, and they've made over the years some progress in their providing the service. But just like as far as I'm compared on the city side of things, on the bi-state side of things, complain, bring issues to our attention, because there's nothing stronger for me to say to the powers that be in city government. I have had 5 people who have had this problem. We need to really work on it. And that makes some progress. So I always encourage our both people who are disabled and also people who are interested in helping people who are disabled to tell us their stories. We collect them and we try to work with them and we try to move forward.
All right, thank you, David. I got another question. Several of them keep coming in, so keep it up. Thank you. Does the plan factor in current future construction plans and related temporary barriers such as the soccer stadium?
Absolutely, yes. So we are looking at sort of known city projects. We are looking at, for example, the soccer stadium. That is one of our priorities, even though it's not open yet. That is part of that citywide prioritization map, as well as sort of those future, assessing those future links to the soccer stadium. David, you can probably speak more about the soccer stadium itself.
Yeah. Well, we have been intensely involved in the design of the soccer stadium and the property around the soccer stadium. That couldn't be a more complex project because Great Rivers Greenway is putting their new brick line path down Market Street right in front of the stadium. The stadium itself understands its obligation to be accessible. And in two of the corners on Olive, one is being handled by one group of grants and another by another group of grants. So it is crazy to get this organized. But having said all that, we are extremely aware of it. We have also, I have the help of my staff and an architect in town, Gina Hilberry, who some of you may know, who have been looking at the design. Well, Gina looks at a lot of stuff, but that includes the design of the inside of the stadium. And we have been working with those designers to make sure that certain accessibility features are in place. And they understand they're obligated under the law to comply. One of the biggest issues with compliance is that people might do something that technically complies but doesn't really help the needs of people with disabilities. I love to tell the story, if I can do an aside for a minute, of a building inspector who was looking at a rehabbed restroom in a restaurant, and he was supposed to give them an occupancy permit to start providing service. And so he goes into the restaurant and he discovers that there aren't any grab bars there. So he tells the owner that they need to put in grab bars in the restaurant. And then a few weeks later, he comes back with a picture, and he's got a picture on a wall. And I say, "What's that, a towel rack?" And he says, "No, that's the grab bar." Well, the grab bar is on the opposite wall from the toilet, so that the grab bar was utterly useless from somebody with a disability. So getting people to figure out how to follow these standards and literally provide the benefit to people with disabilities is a constant teaching process. And we've had that process going on in the stadium too. There were occasions where they were building rooms that if you put a wheelchair in it, you couldn't shut the door, for example, to suites. So we work with them, and generally people are of good faith and they do what they need to do to solve problems. But a lot of people just miss the issue.
And I think it's sort of the next development after the soccer stadium comes up. That is where this is designed to, so that prioritization map adjusts as the new developments happen, and that those sidewalks around it can be assessed of sort of, while we're here doing construction, is there something else that we can do to sort of increase accessibility? And that's really what the hope of this self-evaluation is that it can be very much a document that's used for years and years moving forward to sort of, as things get built within the city, that we can make the city more accessible at the same time.
I have an interesting comment about that. Long ago, the zoo did their self-evaluation and set up their transition plan and have solved problems over the years. And just recently, I was looking at a new facility over there. It's going to be a very nice primate house with the primates actually above ground and people above ground and sort of interacting in a wonderful, as natural as possible way. But I was talking to their staff architect, and he was talking about what he's been able to do. And I think that I know they finished their transition plan in the 90s. And he said to me, you know, this project is really good because I'm going to be able to check off a couple of other items on that transition plan. And he's kept it there. It's on his desk. He knows what he needs to do. He's always looking for the money to get it done.
All right, thank you. Next question. St. Louis has a severe shortage in accessible housing. Is the city considering policies that would encourage private housing to be developed with accessibility in mind?
All new construction is covered by the Fair Housing Act, and there's a certain, not all new construction, because the Fair Housing Act doesn't deal with anybody with fewer than 4 units in the building. But where those regulations apply, then accessible units are being put in the houses. But there is always problems with our housing. We try to help with retrofit, although, you know, many times people call our office and say, we need to put in a ramp. My mother-in-law had a stroke or whatever, and there's very little public money to help with that. But we do search around to see if we can help. In addition to that, for example, Doorways, which is an organization that's helped with people who are HIV positive, is building facilities right now that are going to increase the accessibility for people who are dealing with that disease. And we try to catch it everywhere we can, but a lot of this is dependent upon the strength of charitable organizations making sense. And certain of our developers have been pretty good. I can't name names because some of them haven't been. But in any event, we have people who are of the right idea, but increasing our housing in this city is just terribly difficult.
All right, that's all the questions we have at the moment. Thank you all for the feedback. Very much appreciated. If you have any additional questions, keep entering them and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And I'll turn it back over to Travis.
Thanks, Mike. This sort of next up is community engagement and really sort of how you can help us make this the best possible plan it can be. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Jim.
Thank you, Travis, and good input from David there. And I would just add to the question about the bus company too, and the schedules. The Transit Authority is required under the ADA to also put together a transition plan and self-evaluation. And so your input to them and to, if you will, push east-west to meet their obligation would be helpful also. And then you can deal with issues such as training and issues of tardy buses, etc. That needs to be included in there. Also, before we begin and talk directly about this, I just wanted to point out that we have had past meetings with the public, with neighborhood associations, with the city staff, as well as with the disability community too. And so this is an additional movement to try and get the input and the community engagement. We have an online survey, which has been available now for, I believe, about 5-6 months. And we have some data we've collected from there, but it is not closed. We are interested in everybody participating, and please share this with friends and family and other people that you might know to please take a moment and give your input to the survey. You can see it listed right there on the screen on how you can go into the survey. And again, we just want anybody and everybody. This is your chance. This is, you know, the chance of citizens to give the feedback on how the community looks and where the priorities are. Take those very seriously, and so we hope you'll encourage not only yourself but others to participate in this. It'll provide feedback to us on how residents are using the city facilities, as Travis mentioned earlier. That comes into how we prioritize and put weight on the measurement of which activities need to be taken on immediately. And there are alternative formats available upon request. If you contact David's office there, the Office on the Disabled, you can get the alternative format if that is needed by anybody. Just an example, some of the survey results to this time that we've seen that best, we asked the question of what best describes the reasons you're using the city sidewalks. 80% indicated for exercise, health, or pleasure. 79% access to entertainment and goods and services, such as grocery stores or a restaurant or a hardware store or anything of that nature. 63% socialize with friends and family. So you see the purposes extend not only for, exercise and health, but getting the goods and services. And of course, the next category was travel to school, church, and public facilities. Very important. Again, the ADA stresses that there be accessibility to all aspects of society. So it's not just government, it's not just the private sector, but you see areas such as getting to schools, and being able to move about freely in the community. Other second question, which we felt was important to share with you, was to prioritize the following types or locations of city sidewalks that need to be improved first. Responders indicated in that one that number one was residential streets. Following that was the sidewalks leading to or from schools, followed by access to public transportation, the Metrolink stops. 4 was the intersections that were, needing access there. Obviously, if you're trying to move about the city, it's very important that you're able to get through an intersection. And then sidewalks leading to or from city facilities. And again, this would include not only the city hall, but areas that could be in parks, as well as other city buildings. And then we also have people have submitted photographic curb ramp evaluations, and they ranked the following obstacles. You can look at that. Also gives you an idea of what we're talking about when we mean a trip hazard, which was indicated as the number one issue. I think earlier you heard Travis speak about anything more than a 1/4 inch variance from one section of a sidewalk to another would be considered inaccessible and does require some beveling or some sort of smaller ramp. And then you can go up to a 1/2 inch. But trip hazards, they affect not only people who might be using wheelchairs, but obviously those who are mobility impaired that might use a cane, or those that might have some sort of impairment when they're trying to walk. Plus, let's be honest, people, with the aging population right now in this country, it's very important that we make our surfaces accessible to all people so that we can prevent trip hazards. Standing water and debris came up as the second one, and that's a major issue again. As long as we have a 2% cross grade to allow that water to drain, that's adequate. We do not need surfaces, for instance, that might have a 10% cross slope. With that, if you're wheeling in a wheelchair, you use one hand basically to push your chair while the other one's acting as a brake. Obvious disability, that's difficult for people who are ambulatory that might have difficult in walking, and that also would come into play there. So it's very important that we're building things that don't create standing water areas. The debris issue, boy, we're all involved in that, right? We want to clean up our city, and we want to make sure the debris are not sitting around. That's really a city involvement along with the citizens to try and make that better. Poor surface quality. You already heard us talk about the landing and the difficulty in negotiating cobblestones. That obviously is not a good surface quality for a wheelchair user or again, a person with a mobility impairment. Or you come to an intersection, there's no curb cuts. And this can make it very difficult, again, not just for wheelchair users, but again, for people who might have mobility impairments. So that's important too. The other thing that we found people noting was the encroachments onto public rights of ways. We love sitting outside and going to a restaurant and being out there, but there also still needs to be a path of travel you can get by. Or another type might be somebody hanging a sign from their building, and a visually impaired person could walk right into that sign if it's not built adequately. So any kind of encroachments like that are of concern to the people who have already responded to the survey, and ones we obviously value your input back if you'll take this survey to help us again prioritize the areas that we can make the largest impact. Let's be honest, folks, this is an older city. that was built all the way back, to the 1700s and up to current day, and to go back and replace and fix everything not only takes a great deal of time, but a great deal of money and effort. And so if what we can fix is what we're building in the future, such as was mentioned with the soccer stadium, that's a huge advantage as we attempt to go back and fix areas that may have been around for 200 years plus. And so that's why a prioritization system that Oates has put in place here with all the surveyors that were out across the city, looking at the various facilities as well as sidewalks, gives us a chance to prioritize things, take it to the city. I'm going to say it for David. David can do as much as he can internally, and Eric, to try and get more priority put towards creating accessible environments. But you, the citizens, obviously have to make that aware to your older people that they realize this is needed within the city as well to increase resources to make this a possibility. So I think at this time we've given you a chance to understand the citizen input and to realize this was not done in a vacuum. This was done with the input of disability organizations across the city, but we really want your input as well, as this is an ongoing process. Accessibility is not something you ever, if you will, achieve 100% accessibility. It's an ongoing process to create that. And I think, as David mentioned, when you're talking about program access or getting access to a program or a service, if you're having difficulty now, please let his office know. There are many things that can be fixed immediately, but we might not be aware of those. So we thank you for your time this afternoon, but we look forward to your input in the future and your ongoing involvement. Thank you, Travis.
I think just to kind of close up, I will start with, contact us. David's mentioned it, Jim's mentioned it, I've mentioned it. We want to hear from you. There's an email address down at the bottom, ada_stl@stlewis-mo.gov. If you send an email to that, the email goes to BPS, the Office on the Disabled, as well as the project team. So that's a great way to get a hold of us, to sort of tell us your questions, your feedback, anything that you have. And with that, I would like to open it up to any other questions at this time. Sort of free game, any questions anybody might have. I know we have at least one question from the chat. So Mike?
Yes, one additional question relating to the survey. The question is any of this data aggregated by geography? It is aggregated to some extent, but in other ways, we didn't want, just because a part of the city didn't take part in the survey, we didn't want to devalue that part of the city. So it is taken into account, but it is not the only part of what we're doing with those survey results. Because whether or not someone takes part in the survey or not, that doesn't devalue their right to accessibility. So like anything else, the answer is complicated, but the answer is yes, but it's not the only factor that goes into this prioritization.
But I would also, one of the realities is that people with disabilities are, as a group, among the poorest people in the country. And so what you find is the locations where there's a greater number of people without cars, or there is a greater number of people with low incomes, often that just completely overlaps with where people with disabilities are. So as we look at our, the more, I'm going to use the bad word, macro data that we were talking about earlier, definitely the location of where people have big need is something that shows up because of certain of the larger data that we're getting.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of, with taking that in mind, that's why it's not all just about geography as we get into this. I do see that Katie has her hand raised. Katie, if you would like to unmute yourself.
Cool. Hi, I'm Katie. I live out in Wildwood, but I work in the city of St. Louis, so I obviously care. I'm also disabled and a college student. I feel like that's important backing. But I am wondering what we can do to be getting these changes in place. Like, obviously, you mentioned the Board of Aldermen being one of the places that we can be asking for money for these types of things and asking for their influence. So, should we be contacting older people? Should we be reaching out to them for meetings? Like, what can the average person do?
Well, if I can do that, I guess the answer is in part all of the above. But every time it is very helpful for it to be expressed in real experience stories. So where you see that there is a problem and you want to raise that with people to try to respond to it, my first suggestion is we have a thing that's called the Citizen Service Bureau. Any citizen can make a complaint there, so make a complaint there. If you can identify what a relevant alderman would be, certainly make the complaint there, and let my office know about it. Anytime you're filing a complaint or a grievance, if you also give it to my office, that becomes part of our process of, first of all, we try to work it out, and secondly, we develop knowledge of where people are having troubles, and overall we may be able to push the needle a little bit.
And if I could, David, I'd like to add, this is Jim. Katie, great question, and thank you. Do you have a disability organization at the university or college you're attending?
We're actually in the process of starting one right now. So we're in a kind of unrecognized state I go to American University in DC, and it's currently unrecognized, but like we want to do stuff. So sort of, the answer is sort of.
And I'm very familiar with American University in DC, and you know, what I'm trying to get at is, yes, you have power as a citizen, but I think we all know there's greater power with greater numbers. And so if you're able to get your organization behind you, or to join a local one here too, to get behind the efforts of a Paraquad, for instance, or some of the other organizations, that obviously gets greater oomph when you have greater numbers. And I know in DC, just to share with you, I know that's not what we're discussing, but you've got a great office of that's similar to David's office in DC. I've worked with them in the past, and I know if you air your complaints there, you'll find greater success as well.
And I think something that I'll add to that is that specifics is always sort of better. It's, if someone says the city of St. Louis needs to be accessible for all, that's one thing. But if someone says I can't get to my bus stop to get to work, that's something that David's office can do a lot more with. So it's not, it's, you know, it's one of those, we are advocating for accessibility for the entire city. But when it comes to action, I think that specifics always help, David, whenever it comes to these conversations. Just going to say, if anybody has any other questions, again, please reach out to us. If it hasn't already been posted to the chat yet, we will post a link to the survey. Okay. So the link's out there. The city of St. Louis does have a website for the ADA transition plan that is available. If you go to the Office on the Disabled website, there is a link to the ADA transition plan website there. It has all our contact information. You can view past public meetings as well as this meeting. If anybody would like a copy of the video or the transcript, it will be a couple days before it's ready to go, but please email that ADA_STL website and we will most certainly get it to you. And I think sort of we'll kind of end this with, like, you know, please reach out to us. Please talk to us. We are here to help. We definitely want to hear back from all citizens. So if it's 6 months from now, if it's 3 years from now, David's office is still going to be there and David's office is still going to be advocating. The Board of Public Service is still going to be working to increase accessibility. So this is definitely not a 1 week opportunity. This is 6 months, years from now. Please keep reaching out to us and communicating with us. Eric, before we go, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think you've covered it all. Glad to be able to come and talk to you all today. Please
David?
keep questions coming.
Well, I'm delighted with, we've had a good sized group here today, and I think that's great. I think that things may come to mind after the meeting. You can use that email address if you want to address us that way. I certainly am available too, and my staff is. We're not a big staff, but we certainly are happy to talk to anybody about anything. So be in touch with us and we'll take it from there.
Okay, and with that, I would just like to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today. We definitely appreciate it. Please fill out the survey if you haven't filled it out yet. And everybody have a great night, and hopefully it can stop raining and we can get out and enjoy the city. And with that, thanks everybody for their time, and have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.